There's a really good book by David Montgomery called Dirt. And basically, the idea of the book is that one of the fundamental drivers of human history has been the erosion of soil. And he talks about the way, I mean, this is a really important thing in human history, is agriculture. Agriculture has changed what we are as a species and what we're capable of. And the way that we've done agriculture is really interesting. So, basically, civilizations started in valleys because that's where the soil is the richest and it's the easiest to grow, and it's usually by a source of water. So people farm the valleys, and then the population begins to grow because hunter-gatherers population stays pretty low for several reasons. But as soon as you have agriculture and a steady supply of food and storable food and mushy food that babies can eat, the population starts to grow. So, more and more of the valley gets farmed. And then what happens when you farm is that if you don't know anything about, rejuvenating the soil, replenishing the soil, like putting manure and, compost and organic material back into the soil, then the soil gets depleted. Year after year of growing stuff in the same soil, you get less and less return, less and less yield from the crops, right? So then people start farming the slopes of the valley, and that causes more erosion. Also, tilling the soil causes erosion. So most soil that's in a place that things grow pretty well is covered. It's got plants all over it. And when you till it, you're breaking up the soil, and then if it rains, it washes away some of that topsoil. And if the wind starts blowing and the soil is dry after you've tilled it up, some of that topsoil blows away. And over the years, the topsoil gets weaker, the more it gets thinner and less nutritious for the plants. And then, on top of that, you're growing crops in there, and so it's depleting the soil. So eventually it lacks something, minerals or nitrogen or something, and you get less and less yield from that. So people expand out. Now they have a greater population and they're getting less yield from their soils. So they expand and they go up the slopes, and they get a bigger territory. Sometimes this entails having to conquer somebody else so that you can have that land to grow things. And so essentially, that is the beginning of how civilization starts. And the book is really interesting because he talks about how, for example, the Romans, same thing. They come into a fertile valley. They start growing crops and their population expands, and then they have to grab some land from somebody else. So they start expanding their empire because now they need food, and they're not getting enough food from the land that they already have. So now they need other land. You can either shrink, which has happened also. There's another way to do it, is that people just leave the area and disband or go find some other fertile soil somewhere. Or you can keep your group together and expand, and that entails armies and conquering. And so the Roman Empire began to expand, which formed an even bigger group and a bigger population, and then they had to keep expanding. So then they expanded into North Africa because there were fertile soils in North Africa, and so on. And so you're looking at history through the lens of soil erosion, how much it drove what happened in history. Why did the Romans keep expanding? That's why. Because they needed fertile soil. One of the interesting factors about that is that they knew at the time what they could do that would keep their soil fertile. But each individual farmer has to make a living this year with this crop. So it's even though it has long-term consequences, like it takes a long time, years, sometimes hundreds of years, for the soil to be depleted enough to be really not worth growing anything on. So every year it might be a little bit different, but this year you need crops so that you can pay your bills, so you can make a living, right? So it takes extra work to put manure on the soil, to put organic material back in, to, compost things. They knew how to do these things. They just didn't do them for the most part. They instead, it was, the farm was being worked by somebody that didn't own the farm. It was wealthy people that owned the land, and they had people working for them that worked the farm. And so they were kind of like making short-term decisions, and it all added up to depleted soils and the need to conquer new lands. And so the Roman Empire kept expanding. Here's another example from history. In the South, in the United States, they were growing tobacco and corn. Both of these deplete the soil fairly quickly of nitrogen. Wait, did I just say corn? No, not corn. Cotton. Tobacco and cotton. That's what they grew in the South. It was also a very labor-intensive crop, both of the crops. So they had slavery, and they needed to keep expanding. So they expanded across the South, the region where cotton can grow and tobacco can grow. And at some point, people in the North said, you know what? I don't think we should allow slavery to expand into any more states. But the South really needed to expand because they had depleted the soils that they had already used, and they needed new soil. They needed new land. So they were between a rock and a hard place. If they stayed where they were going to go broke. They needed to expand. And the North was adamant. They did not want any more states with slavery being legal in it. So that's how they came to their impasse that created the Civil War and changed the country. It was all driven by erosion. And of course, the same thing is happening still. Most farmers have to pay their bills this year. They have to have a crop this year. They may know that in the long run they're going to deplete the soil, but in the short run they need to get a crop in and they need to get it harvested. So there's a kind of the same things happening. There's a lot of erosion happening, and the soil is being depleted, and then they'll sell the land or do something else with it. Now, luckily, there are people that are doing the opposite. And when we come back, we'll find out more about those people. This Atom Bomb podcast episode is sponsored by Anchor, a podcast platform, the one I'm using to make this podcast. It's super easy to use and allows you to easily create your own podcast. You can record and edit your audio right onto the app. In fact, you can do everything on your phone. Anchor also makes it easy to monetize your podcast and get wide distribution. Anchor automatically makes your podcast available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. You can download the Anchor app for free or go to anchor.fm to get started. There are people that are regenerating grasslands, for example, and making it so that there's no soil erosion, still producing food. There are organic farmers that are continually putting organic material back into the soil, and the soil can actually become richer and richer over time if you do it right. It's labor intensive, but they found that organic farms withstand drought a lot better, partly because they have so much organic material in the soil, it holds water better. But that's a topic of another podcast. I just wanted you to know about this in case you hadn't heard about the book Dirt. It's fantastic, and I highly recommend it. One of the things that you can do about this is that your choices when you buy food ultimately determine whether the soil is eroding or not. If you buy regeneratively grown beef, for example, you know that the soil is not eroding. It's actually getting richer. If you're buying organically grown vegetables, for example, you know that soil is getting richer and it's not eroding as much. It's still eroding. Most organic farms still plow the soil, which really does make the soil erode. But there are actually some farms that it's called no-till agriculture, and that they use ground cover or cover crops. And then they just plant plants in among the cover crops. And so that's much less erosion. So anyway, your choices in the foods that you buy have something to do with whether the soil is eroded. And according to David Montgomery, the guy that wrote the book, civilizations only last a certain amount of time, and the reason is erosion. So if we can prevent erosion, that's a good thing. And you, in your choices of buying food, can determine how much erosion that you personally are causing. Just something to think about. This is Adam Lee Kahn on The Atom Bomb.